The old barn stood silent, bathed in the golden glow of the evening sun. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. In the middle of the field, a majestic horse stood alone, his deep, brown eyes scanning the horizon. His name was Thunder, and for years he had been waiting. Once, he had a best friend, another horse named Dakota. They grew up together, running free across in the fields, playing in the summer rain, and resting under the stars. They were inseparable, but one heartbreaking day, Dakota was taken away. Thunder watched helplessly as his friend disappeared down the long dirt road, his cries echoing in the wind. Since that day, something inside Thunder had changed. He no longer galloped with joy. He no longer neighed with excitement when the sun rose. The spark in his eyes had faded. But tonight was different. A familiar scent drifted through the air. Thunder's ears perked up. His heart pounded in his chest. Could it be? Was it really him? Then, in the distance, a shadow appeared. Thunder's breath caught. His legs trembled, and as the figure stepped closer, his eyes widened with disbelief. It was Dakota. After all these years, his best friend had returned. Thunder stood frozen, his breath heavy, his heart pounding against his ribs. Was this real? Could it truly be Dakota standing just beyond the fence, his shape barely visible in the soft glow of the setting sun? For a moment, Thunder didn't move. He was afraid that if he stepped forward, the vision would disappear, just like the countless dreams he had over the years. But then, Dakota took a small, unsteady step closer, and Thunder saw him clearly for the first time in so long. Dakota was thinner now, his ribs faintly visible beneath his dust-covered coat. His once bright eyes looked weary, holding the weight of years apart. His mane was tangled, his hooves covered in dried mud. He looked different, older, worn by time, but there was no mistaking it. This was his best friend. Thunder's body trembled, a whirlwind of emotions crashing over him. Joy, disbelief, longing, but mixed with them was something else: hesitation. Would Dakota remember him? Would he still want to be friends after so many years? Dakota lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking forward. He let out a soft, almost hesitant whinny, weak, uncertain, nothing like the playful, eager calls they used to share. But the moment Thunder heard it, something inside him broke free. With a powerful surge, Thunder bolted forward. His hooves pounded against the earth as he raced toward the fence. His chest heaved, his breath came fast, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Dakota was here. He had waited so long, and now, finally, they were together again. As he reached the fence, Thunder skidded to a halt, dust swirling around him. He stretched his neck over the wooden beams, reaching for Dakota, his warm breath stirring the dust from his friend's fur. Dakota hesitated for just a second before stepping closer. Their noses touched, and in that instant, time seemed to stand still. Thunder let out a deep, trembling breath. The scent, it was real. This was not a dream. Dakota closed his eyes, pressing his head lightly against Thunder's. He was exhausted, his body weak, but there was something else in his eyes, now something familiar. A quiet recognition, a spark that had not been there a moment before. Thunder felt a lump rise in his throat. If horses could cry, he would have. Instead, he let out a deep, low nicker, the same sound he had made every night, calling for his lost friend. And now, at last, Dakota had answered. But something was wrong. Dakota swayed slightly, his legs trembling as if they could barely hold his weight. Thunder pulled back, concern flashing through him. Dakota was hurt. He was startled, and suddenly, joy turned to worry. Thunder nudged Dakota gently, urging him to stay awake. Dakota's ears flicked weakly, but his body sagged. He needed help. Thunder turned his head toward the farmhouse, his eyes searching. Someone had to see them. Someone had to help. He couldn't lose Dakota again, not now. Not after all this time. With all the strength in his lungs, Thunder threw his head back and let out the loudest, most desperate neigh he had ever given. A call for help, a plea to save his best friend. And this time, someone would hear it. Thunder's desperate call echoed through the quiet fields. The farmhouse stood in the distance, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. For a few moments, only silence. Then a door creaked open. Footsteps hurried across the wooden porch. "Thunder?" a familiar voice called. It was Emma, the young woman who had cared for Thunder since he was a colt. She never heard him cry out like this before. Wiping her hands on her jeans, she rushed toward the pasture, her heart pounding. As she reached the fence, her breath caught in her throat. There, just beyond the wooden beams, stood a thin, exhausted horse. His coat was dull, his body frail. He barely had the strength to hold his head up. "Oh no," Emma whispered. Thunder stomped his hooves anxiously, his eyes pleading with her. "Help. Pull him, please." Emma didn't hesitate. She unlatched the gate and stepped toward Dakota carefully, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. Safe now." Dakota flinched at first, his ears flicking back. He didn't trust humans. She had been let down before. But as Thunder stepped closer, standing protectively by his side, Dakota took a slow, shaky breath. He didn't move away. With gentle hands, Emma placed a rope around Dakota's neck, guiding him toward the barn. He was weak, stumbling with every step, but Thunder stayed close, nudging him forward when he hesitated. Inside the barn, Emma spread fresh hay on the ground and set out a bucket of water. She grabbed a few apples from a basket, cutting them into small pieces. "Come on, boy. Eat something," she urged, holding the food out. Dakota stared at the apples, his nostrils flaring. His stomach must have been empty, but he didn't move. He didn't trust the food. Thunder, standing beside him, picked up a piece of apple and crunched it between his teeth. He chewed slowly, then nudged Dakota gently. Dakota hesitated. Then, finally, he lowered his head. He took a tiny bite, then another. Emma let out a relieved breath. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Over the next few days, Dakota's concern worried Emma. He ate very little, and often stood still for hours, staring at nothing. Every time she approached, he flinched. He didn't fight hate, was too weak for that, but fear still lingered in his tired eyes. Emma sighed as she leaned against the barn door watching him. "What happened to you, boy?" she murmured. Thunder never left Dakota's side. He lay beside him at night, pressed close to keep him warm. He nuzzled him during the day, urging him to eat, to move, to remember who he used to be. But progress was slow. Emma began to doubt herself. Could she really save Dakota? What if he never got better? What if she was just making him suffer more? Her father wasn't happy about the extra burden. "Emma, we can't afford to take in another horse," he reminded her. "Thunder is one thing, but this one needs a vet, medicine, food. It's not that simple." Emma knew he was right. Their farm was small, money was tight, and Dakota's recovery could take months. But as she looked at Thunder standing protectively beside his old friend, she knew she couldn't give up. "I'll find a way," she promised, more to herself than anyone else. One evening, after another long day of tending to Dakota, Emma sat on a hay bale, exhausted. She watched as Thunder nibbled at Dakota's mane, a playful habit they used to share. Dakota reacted at first, but then something small happened. He sighed, a deep, slow sigh, like a weight had lifted from his chest. Emma's eyes widened. That was the first time he had truly relaxed. Encouraged, she stood up and walked over. Slowly, reached out her hand. Dakota stiffened, his ears twitching, but this time, he didn't pull away. Her fingers brushed against his neck. His fur was rough, scarred from past hardships. Gently, she ran her hand down, his side whispering, "You're safe now." And then it happened. Dakota leaned into her touch. It was barely noticeable, just a slight shift of his weight, but it was there, a choice, a moment of trust. Tears stung Emma's eyes. For the first time, she truly believed Dakota was going to be okay. Emma wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Dakota had leaned into her touch just for a moment, but it meant everything. It was the first real sign that he was starting to trust her. Thunder stood close, watching over his old friend, his dark eyes filled with quiet understanding. Emma gave Dakota one last gentle pat before stepping back, letting him rest. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a faint mark, hidden beneath the dirt and tangled fur on Dakota's neck. It looked like an old scar, long and thin, running just below his mane. Emma frowned. Had he been injured before? Had someone hurt him? Her chest tightened at the thought. Carefully, she reached out and brushed her fingers over the scar. Dakota stiffened but didn't pull away. It wasn't a fresh wound. It told a story, a painful one. The next morning, Emma returned to the barn early. The air was crisp, and the sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange. Dakota was standing, more alert than before, but still weary. Thunder was beside him, as always. Emma brought a bucket of warm water and a soft cloth, determined to clean the dirt from Dakota's coat. He needed to be cared for, and if she was to help him heal, she had to know what he had been through. As she gently wiped away the layers of dust and grime, something else caught her attention. There, hidden beneath his mane, was something small and worn a faint marking burned into his skin. Emma's breath hitched. A brand. Her fingers traced the faded symbol, her mind racing. Branding was common on large ranches, used to her mark ownership. But this one, it looked old. Had Dakota belonged to someone before? Had he been lost, or worse, abandoned? Emma stepped back, her heart pounding. She needed answers. That afternoon, after making sure Dakota was comfortable, she went inside and pulled out her laptop. She typed in everything she could think of: old horse brands, lost horses, missing animals. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this mark held the key to Dakota's past. And then she found something. A website dedicated to lost and stolen horses. She scrolled through the pages, her pulse quickening. Then she saw it. A post from nearly 5 years ago. A chestnut horse with a white blaze on his forehead. A brand almost identical to the one on Dakota's neck. Emma clicked on the post, her hands shaking. The horse had belonged to a boy named Caleb. The story was Heartbreaking Caleb. And his family had lived on a small ranch. And Dakota, once called Scout, had been his best friend. But one night, during a terrible storm, the ranch's fences had collapsed. In the chaos, Scout had run off. The family searched for months, but he was never found. Emma's throat tightened. All this time, Dakota hadn't just he had been searching for home. She read further, her eyes stinging with emotion. Caleb had been just 12 years old when he lost Scout. Now, he would be older, maybe even grown. Was he still looking for his horse? Did he still remember him? Emma glanced toward the barn, where Dakota stood resting. He had been through so much. He had survived hunger, fear, and loneliness. And yet, deep down, maybe he had never stopped, just like thunder had never stopped waiting for him. She closed her laptop and took a deep breath. There was only one thing left to do. She had to find Caleb. Would he still want Dakota after all these years? Would Dakota even remember him? Emma didn't know. But one thing was certain: this rescue wasn't just about saving Dakota anymore. It was about giving him the ending he deserved. And maybe, just maybe, it was about something bigger than that. Maybe it was about healing old wounds, not just Dakota's, but her own. She had lost things too. She had known what it felt like to be alone, to wonder where she truly belonged. Maybe that's why she couldn't give up on him. Maybe, in saving Dakota, she was saving a part of herself. Emma grabbed her phone and took a deep breath. It was time to make the call. Emma's hands trembled as she held the phone. She had found the contact number listed in the old post, but there was no way to know if it was still active. Her heart pounded as she pressed call. Each ring felt like forever. Then, a voice answered. Hello? It was a man's voice, hesitant, unsure. Emma took a deep breath. Hi, is this Caleb? There was a pause. Yes, who's this? Emma's throat tightened. I think I found your horse. Silence, then a sharp inhale. What? His voice cracked. Scout? That's impossible. He's been gone for years. I know, Emma said softly, but he's here. He's safe. Caleb didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, Emma could hear the emotion in his voice. Where are you? They arranged to meet at the farm the next day. Emma barely slept that night, torn between happiness and heartbreak. Dakota had a family. He had a home. But what about Thunder? They had just found each other again. How could they say goodbye now? The next afternoon, a dusty old truck pulled up the long dirt road leading to the barn. A young man stepped out, tall and strong, but with a softness in his eyes. Caleb. His gaze swept over the farm, searching, until it landed on Dakota. His breath hitched. Scout, he whispered. Dakota, standing by the fence, lifted his head. His ears twitched. His nostrils flared, and for a long moment he just stared. Emma held her breath. Would he remember? Would he care? And then Dakota moved. Not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with purpose. His tired legs found new strength as he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Caleb's hands shook as he reached out. When his fingers brushed Dakota's muzzle, a choked sob escaped his throat. "You're really here?" he murmured, his voice breaking. He pressed his forehead against Dakota's, his shoulders shaking. "I thought I lost you forever." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. When she turned to Thunder, her heart nearly broke. Thunder stood frozen, his dark eyes locked on Dakota. His ears twitched uncertainly. His best friend, his brother, was going home, but not with him. Dakota turned, nudging Caleb gently, then glanced back at Thunder. The old gelding took a slow step forward, then stopped. His body was tense, as if he wasn't sure what to do. Dakota let out a soft whinny and stepped toward Thunder, resting his head against his friend's neck. It was the same way he had leaned on him for comfort all those nights. In the barn, Thunder stood still for a moment. Then, finally, he closed his eyes and pressed back. Emma wiped at her eyes. It was as if Dakota was saying thank you, and Thunder was letting him go. Caleb turned to Emma, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't thank you enough for this. I never thought I'd see him again." Emma smiled, though her heart ached. "He's been searching for you for a long time." Caleb nodded, stroking Dakota's mane. "I'll take him home tomorrow. Give him time to rest tonight." Emma glanced at Thunder, watching as he nudged Dakota one last time before stepping back. She could see it in his eyes. He understood. This was the end of their journey together. That night, Emma sat outside the barn, listening to the quiet sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls. Thunder stood in his usual spot, but Dakota was beside him, just like always. They had one last night together, one last memory. The next morning, the truck was loaded, and Dakota was ready to leave. He hesitated at the trailer door, looking back at Thunder. Emma held her breath. Thunder stepped forward, his ears pricked, his dark eyes steady. Then, in one final act of love, he lowered his head and gently nuzzled Dakota's cheek. A goodbye, a blessing. Dakota turned, walked into the trailer, and didn't look back. As the truck disappeared down the road, Thunder stood at the fence, watching until there was nothing left to see. Then slowly, he lowered his head and walked back to the pasture, the wind ruffling his mane. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek. "Goodbye, Dakota," she whispered. But deep in her heart, she knew goodbyes weren't forever. Thunder and Dakota had found each other once. Maybe, just maybe, fate would bring them together again. Thunder stood alone in the pasture, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where Dakota had disappeared. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last traces of his best friend. Emma watched him, her heart aching. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she knew some losses couldn't be softened with words. Instead, she him slowly, reaching out a gentle hand. Thunder didn't move at first, but then, after a long moment, he turned his head and rested, his muzzle against her shoulder. It was a quiet acceptance, a silent understanding. They had both lost something precious, but they still had each other. Days passed, then weeks. Thunder adjusted to his new reality, but Emma could see the change in him. He was quieter, more distant. Yet, at the same time, something was different within her too. She had saved Dakota, but in a way, Dakota had saved her as well. He had reminded her that true love was selfless. It meant letting go, even when it hurt. One was evening, as the sky burned with the colors of sunset, Thunder lifted his head and let out a long, deep whinny. Emma smiled, watching him. Maybe he was calling out Dakota. Maybe, somewhere far away, Dakota was calling back. As Emma leaned against the fence, she realized something love never truly leaves. It lingers in memories, in quiet moments, in the spaces between one heartbeat and the next. And, sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear its echo in the wind.